was scared of dentists in the dark. I was scared of pretty girls and starting conversations. Oh, my friends are turning green.
In 2005, elementary and middle school age kids across the country became enraptured by a new fantasy property, one blending comedy with genuinely emotional storytelling, one driven by exceptional world building and plenty of lovable, compelling characters, one that appealed directly to kids without talking down to them, one so commercially popular and ripe for sequels and spin-offs that it ended up spawning a whole franchise. In 2010, it was made into an absolutely abysmal live-action film, a movie despised by fans that quickly earned its place in the pantheon of worst adaptations of all time. And unless you've been living under a rock these past few months, you know that a streaming service recently decided to take a crack at it again, this time turning the beloved property into an 8-episode-long live-action television series. The show was heavily anticipated by fans, but despite its impressive streaming numbers, was met with mixed reactions. I am, of course, talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender. Yeah, so a friendly space ninja whom I love kind of took the air out of my sail because he made the exact same comparison in his video about the Percy Jackson show, but it is truly funny how similar these two properties' trajectories have been. They also happen to be some of my favorite properties of all time. I don't want to compare them too closely because, it's not fair to compare a middle grade book series to an episodic, serialized, animated kids' TV series. It's also not fair to compare anything to the original Atla because it's one of the greatest works of art ever created, but they definitely have something to teach us when it comes to the act of adaptation. Obviously, everyone and their mom has remarked on how Hollywood these days just wants to make reboots and sequels and adaptations and even straight-up remakes of previous attempts to adapt an IP, all in the hopes that someone with some semblance of nostalgia for the original will show up to watch the new content based on name recognition alone. The worst subtrend of this, in my opinion, is live-action remakes of animated classics. Disney is most famous for this, making extremely literal live-action adaptations of their animated movies, and now Netflix has adapted Avatar: The Last Airbender, a literal perfect show, into not even a movie but just another TV show. I only really heard about the show after the OG creators had already departed over creative differences, which did not inspire optimism among fans. But if I'm going to be honest, I don't know that any version of this show should have been made. Like I said, there is no room to improve on a show like Avatar, and it's extremely condescending to imply that live-action movies or series are the inherently superior art form, that every animated work isn't complete unless it has a live-action counterpart. You might think that that's not what's being implied by these remakes, but let me ask, how many animated remakes of live-action series or movies do you know of? If anything, they should have adapted Legend of Korra, a decent show that had plenty of room for improvement, would have looked just as cool in live action, and would be more open to experimentation and adaptational changes given how inconsistent and at times messy the original was. But the original Percy Jackson and the Olympians wasn't another TV show, it was a 5-book series. Adapting books to screen makes so much more sense to me because those are entirely different forms of art with different rules. You're not only likely striking a totally different audience, but fans of the original can appreciate a good translation of the original that brings it to life. This isn't to say that films or TV are superior to books, because the two are too different to compare like that. One is trying to paint a picture in the mind of the reader through the talent of the writing. The other is trying to convince the viewer that what they are looking at on screen is to some extent real. There are advantages and disadvantages to both media, and because there are different rules for writing for the page versus the screen, there are approximately a dozen different ways for adaptation to go wrong. So today, I will be taking a look at the one adaptation between the two that I think had a real shot at being successful, the one that deserved to get made. It's not necessarily an in-depth breakdown of any particular episode or even the series as a whole. I'm trying to focus on the big picture here and answer whether, in the current course of big-budget Hollywood remakes and misguided adaptations, true art can rise above the pack and satisfy both fans of the original and newcomers alike. Buckle up, demigods. We're going back to Camp Half-Blood. Adaptation is hard. For every example of a show, book, or stage production being translated to the screen well, there are 2 to 5 examples of it going poorly to disastrously. I think it's telling that many of the best films or shows based on other properties were based on average source material, like Jaws or The Godfather, both popular books that read more like pop fiction than high art. As for well-regarded source materials, most successful adaptations follow the source material almost to the letter. Many Jane Austen and Shakespeare adaptations fit into this category. I can only think of a few exceptions, like Kubrick's version of Stephen King's The Shining, or more recently, Greta Gerwig's take on Little Women. But for the most part, there is a clear association between fidelity to the source material and the end result's success among audiences, critics, and fans of the original, especially if you don't go into the project with the plan to make something entirely different from the source material, like Kubrick clearly did with The Shining. If you want to tell the same story in the same genre to appeal to the same audience just in a different medium, you need to pay attention to how the source material accomplished what it did. That being said, if you take a 300 or 400 page book or a 20 episode long season of TV and you try to make it into a 2-hour long movie, you're gonna have to cut stuff. A lot of stuff. And there comes a point where you've cut so much that the emotional payoff of the source material will not work in adaptation. So you have no choice but to create new dialogue, scenes, and even entirely new characters by either creating new ones whole cloth or condensing elements of the original source material. So in the end, you're forced to choose. You can either make a 10-hour long movie literally translating every single page of the book, which you're not going to do, make a movie very faithfully adapting parts of the book but then ignoring other parts entirely for the sake of runtime, resulting in a story that feels incomplete and unsatisfying in comparison to the original, which you don't want to do, or prioritize translating the spirit of the book to the screen as opposed to the literal events and words on the page by adapting the most important elements faithfully, but condensing everything a little bit and only deviating from the source material when you can create the same emotions more efficiently. You remain faithful to the big picture, but not the tiny brushstrokes. The last option is obviously the most difficult to do from a creative standpoint, and I would hate to have the job of writing a screenplay that somehow accomplishes that while abiding by the limits of budget and studio mandates and the crushing weight of fan expectations. But with the right resources, a skilled writer and director can manage this. In my opinion, this is really the only way to properly adapt a property like Percy Jackson and the Olympians. So with this in mind, this standard for page-to-screen adaptations, how did the Percy Jackson show do, both as an adaptation and just as a TV show in general? I need to preface anything I say about this show by saying that I am biased in more ways than one. Not only am I more invested in the show in that I want it to be good, but also I'm so deeply immersed in the books and the universe and the fandom that I often forget how things will come across to the average viewer. It's hard to put myself in the place of someone who hasn't read the books or hasn't read them in a long time. I forget what information has been exposited, for example, because I already know all the world building and plot points going in. I'm also not a good judge of whether something is explained well for the same reason. I look for details like which characters and events will be more important later. My brain pays extra attention to things that were changed, whether they were changed for the better or worse. In general, I think watching this show as a hardcore Percy Jackson fan tends to put you in the headspace of missing the forest for the trees. You're so hyped up for every character introduction and every iconic book scene and finally finding out if the show is truly as faithful as Rick promised that you forgot to see if you even like the show. As a show. Disney premiering the episodes 1 week at a time instead of a binge model also meant rewatching and analyzing every episode, each and every scene, and helping to pick it apart on social media. In some ways, consuming content that slowly can help you digest and appreciate it better, but when you're obsessing over it, you tend to forget that each individual puzzle piece that you're looking at fits into a greater picture. I am not big on Percy Jackson's social media compared to some fans. I'm not even on TikTok for one, so I can't speak to a lot of the drama and arguments happening in some fan spaces. But from my corner of Twitter, I was a little aggravated to see some fans leap to judgment about the show and the direction it was taking early on. Again, I'm not talking about fans disliking big things like acting or editing. I mean stuff like the writers changing Percy getting 3 pearls to Percy getting 4, and fans immediately assuming that they just forgot the prophecy and didn't have a plan for how his mother was going to end up left behind in the underworld without strictly adhering to the exact plot from the book beat for beat. Guys, I'm pretty sure they're going to address it. I know the episodes are premiering one at a time, but the story is done. They are not making it up on the fly. So while I am hyper aware of all the small changes made in adaptation, I'm also trying to be cognizant of the fact that not all changes are as major as fans make them out to be. It's fine that Percy gets 4 pearls instead of 3. It's fine that the gang teleports from Las Vegas to Santa Monica instead of taking a cab, or from the underworld to Long Island instead of being arrested by the FBI and put on a plane. I don't even mind that Hephaestus shows up in the Tunnel of Love sequence, or that they meet Hermes in the Lotus Casino. It's a big departure from the events of the book, but nothing canon breaking. Not all of these changes were equally motivated, but they also weren't bad. The major changes made were more like trends than specific events. The tone is definitely darker and drier. Antagonists are more nuanced and less cartoonish. There are more appearances from the gods, who also have more internal emotional conflict explored. They introduce some flashback sequences, as well as moments from outside of Percy's POV, which is actually a huge change that I don't see people talking about as much. The action sequences make up a bigger proportion of the story compared to interstitial and reflective scenes. Characters other than Percy seem to get less time devoted to their own storylines and struggles, again with the exception of the gods, who are actually humanized more. These are just a few examples, but none of these changes to me were kill shots to the whole show. Maybe some could have been more detrimental in isolation, but when taken as a whole, I think the show was just going for a different vibe in terms of tone and even genre. That all being said, there are risks with making big changes to the source material, and there were both negative and positive consequences to these changes. As a result, the main issues with this show are pretty much inseparable from the changes made in adaptation. So let's get into the meat of the show: the good, the bad, and the different. When discussing how this show is written, both on the macro and micro level, I'm going to continue referencing the source material. But to be clear, I'm not doing this on the assumption that the book did everything correctly and the show failed every time it deviated. I think I've made it clear at this point that some adaptational changes were always going to be necessary. But I do bring them up because these changes are relevant and helpful when trying to understand where an adaptation fails and succeeds as its own piece of art. I feel like a lot of the issues the writers ran into when making a season of fantasy action television out of this book is the action element. They wanted some form of battle against some villain in every episode, but that's not exactly what the book gives us. The more I re-examine the source material, the more I realize that there is both too much lore to fit into these 8 episodes and not enough action to fill them up. I mean, for a book, it's paced perfectly. It's the hero's journey almost to a T, start to end. But the different challenges the kids run into during their quest are not all equal. I don't mean in terms of quality, but in terms of how long they take, what the antagonist or antagonizing force is, how the issue is solved, what the kids learn from it. They all fight the Furies on the bus, they get lured in by Medusa and fight her, Percy runs into and fights Echidna and the Chimera, they verbally spar with Ares but come to an agreement, they get trapped in the Lotus Casino before figuring it out and just leaving, they get tricked by Procrustes before Percy tricks him back and kills him, they almost get killed by Cerberus before Annabeth uses dog training tactics to make him back down, and in between there are several scenes of them reflecting, strategizing, bonding, and freeing zoo animals. This is good. You want your heroes to encounter a variety of challenges so they have the opportunity to grow and the story doesn't get repetitive. It's actually kind of like the original Avatar. Not every episode had Aang and the gang fighting the bad guys to win the day. But I don't think the showrunners wanted to settle for that, or maybe they thought the show would seem anticlimactic if there wasn't some kind of thrilling action sequence multiple times an episode. That's why there's a weird trap at the start of Hephaestus' water park, why Cerberus not only comes very close to eating them, but also then chases them through the rest of the underworld, why Echidna and the Chimera are introduced way earlier in their episode. It's all to stretch out the conflict. And it's also funny that after the manipulation of the book events, the pacing is still so weird. It's occasionally really good. I think the first 2 episodes and the last episode are really on point. But the jumps between episodes just feel strange, almost like the creators wrote one long story with as much action as possible, and then chopped them up into episodes based on when each villain appears and dies. The runtimes are all roughly the same, but there's very little transition between them. And of course, I must mention the pervasive cuts to black throughout this season. It feels like every action sequence or important scene concludes with an abrupt cut to black, usually to indicate that Percy is losing consciousness, but then sometimes it happens when he definitely does not. I immediately assumed this was for the purpose of inserting ad breaks at some point, but part of me does wonder if it was also used as a crutch for when the writers couldn't figure out how to transition between moods. But either way, it immediately diffuses the tension of a scene right when it's crescendoing. This is certainly a show with very little falling action. So we are definitely privileging the action over all other kinds of scenes here, especially the more reflective ones. But there are times when the characters do get to sit and talk about what's going on or reflect inward or on their past. Unfortunately, those scenes aren't used for character development as much as plot exposition. That's the other half of what I said when I said the books have too much lore and not enough action to be adapted into an action show. When the writers aren't rushing to get to the next fight scene, they're using the time to dump exposition on you. Almost every scene between Percy and another character is an excuse for them to just explain what's going on, what their character's motivations are, or to give some information that will immediately become relevant afterwards. Now, to be clear, when you have a limited time to spend on dialogue, you need to be efficient. This was always going to be a show heavy on exposition because its source material is just dense with lore, and our main character is a newcomer to this world. Plus, we need to assume our audience doesn't know much, if anything, about Greek mythology. But I think the combination of cutting out reflective scenes in favor of action while keeping the exposition-heavy dialogue really did the show a disservice. Now the ratio is off. What conversation scenes we get are more informational than anything. I feel like this is a problem with an easy solution, and it's to just make the episodes longer and include all of it. I promise fewer people will complain about the exposition if it doesn't feel like every time a character opens their mouth to talk to Percy, they're going to dump some lore, even if the show technically has the same exact amount of lore being dumped. And this character building work isn't optional, it's essential for the show to pay off. Will the pacing of each individual episode be affected by this? Sure. But the thing is, the show is already so weirdly paced and probably being binged at this point that I think fans and casual viewers alike just want interesting TV. I don't imagine viewers complaining about a lack of action if the scenes replacing it are 1, funny, and 2, help develop the characters and their relationships with each other. That's only half the exposition problem, though. The weird thing about this show, and something definitely not present in the original, is how prescient the heroes are throughout. They figure out who Medusa is immediately. They know that the Lotus Hotel is a trap before they even enter the building. Percy walks into Progrestus's shop and just tells him who he is because he already knows somehow. This was such a strange choice, but I do have some theories as to why it was made. It could be because the writers didn't want the characters to look stupid by, for example, showing up to a garden statue store owned by a woman named Auntie M who wears a veil over her eyes and not realizing that she's Medusa. Or maybe it was to cater to fans, since they would already know all of these twists in advance, and thus finding them out wouldn't be as exciting as it was written. As for the first explanation, I think outside of Annabeth figuring out Medusa's identity, it's kind of dumb to assume these kids would be too smart to fall into these traps. Even Annabeth, who's very intelligent, still hasn't been outside of camp for years and is very inexperienced. As for the second explanation, I think it's dumb to jump past the process of figuring things out just because the audience or even just a portion of the audience already knows it. It's the critical thinking process that not only makes for interesting TV, but lets the audience get to know the characters better. It's so much more compelling to see someone's intelligence or attitude to problem solving demonstrated by them thinking through a problem in real time. Compared to the pacing issue, I think this one is actually both easier and more likely to be fixed by season 2. All they need to do is adapt the books as written, so that during conflicts the heroes are making discoveries and solving problems in real time. They have the blueprint for this, they just need to do it.
You were like 2 seconds ahead of me, seriously. Sometimes it might be okay to just let the easy ones go.
Here's the good news. Despite these writing flaws, this show is actually really funny. Once you take out all the exposition, of which there is a lot, the dialogue is good, and this is critical to get right. The humor of the Percy Jackson universe, and especially the first 5 books, is a huge aspect of their identity and their popularity. The comedic vibe defines the mood and establishes that even though there are real stakes in the story, it never takes itself too seriously. Like, yes, the books are telling a real story with real consequences for the characters, and they've never shied away from deep or even intense topics. But the story is also silly. Like, the Minotaur is wearing bright white Fruit of the Loom brand underwear, Cerberus the three-headed dog from hell is distracted with a red rubber ball, and there's a semi-serious action scene made out of a game of Capture the Flag, because at the end of the day, these are still a bunch of kids and teens at a summer camp. Now, not all of this makes it into the show. To be clear, this version is more grounded and takes itself more seriously. I believe because it's trying to be more of an action-adventure story for all ages, more than a funny fantasy story made for kids that just happens to be so well written it appeals to teens and adults as well. It's also possible that they decided that the book's silly tone wouldn't work on screen, which, to be fair, it would be very difficult to pull that off. These books are middle grade, not YA. They're meant to appeal to kids ages like 8 to 13 as their core demographic. Media for younger audiences are used to using silly gags or one-off jokes to diffuse the tension of a situation and keep things from getting too intense. Without moments like this scattered throughout, a scene or storyline runs the risk of feeling like it came straight out of another book or another movie. Disney animated films are a great example of this. Even in some of the most intense stories, the visual gags and comic relief are always present, and in the few instances where they fail to be consistent with it, the tone really suffers from the dissonance in a noticeable way. But this show feels like it's aiming at a slightly older audience, and as a result, the tone is changed. Maybe this will be an unpopular opinion, but I don't really mind that in concept. I actually think it may have been the best choice. Funnily enough, I think the argument that the tone was changed to appeal to a wider audience is actually the weakest reason to adjust the tone. One of Disney's goals is certainly to bring in kid and adult viewers who may not have read the books. But I think had the tone been adapted faithfully, kids would still like it, and adults may see it as a bit young for them, but still enjoy the story and its humor. I think the comedic, light-hearted tone of Percy Jackson, everything that makes it explicitly not YA, is what sets it apart from the many fantasy, sci-fi, and dystopian franchises of the last 10 to 15 years. Thus, the deviation might even be more interesting to older viewers who are sick of the typical YA shtick. Having said all that, I think enough of the humorous tone is preserved to set the PJO series apart from the rest. The reason I really think the change in humor is beneficial is honestly more practical than anything else. It's very hard to do a story that is equal parts comedy and drama without one impinging on the other's effectiveness. More often than not, either the jokes undercut the seriousness of the events, or the serious events make the humor feel uncomfortably out of place. I think it works in books a bit better because, well, books are more subjective, they leave more up to the reader's imagination, and the reader is really good at filling in gaps in tone, mood, and emotion between scenes. Not to mention, in the PJO books, you have Percy's inner dialogue breaking down the ridiculousness of everything and reiterating what's most important for the reader. Yes, it's still possible for things to feel out of place in a book, but it's much harder than on screen. In a TV show or film, everything must be conveyed to the audience very deliberately, including how the audience is supposed to feel during each scene or in response to each beat. In animation, things are stylized, so you get a bit more wiggle room. Think about Miles throwing a bagel at Future the Spot in the middle of a fight scene in Spider-Verse, but live action is unforgivably literal. That scene would not have played well in live action. With this in mind, I think it's wise to give this show its own identity as a bit more of a serious adventure story meant to appeal to kids, tweens, and teens alike. Now, this is all with the caveat that the show can still be and must be funny. Just because the monsters aren't as outlandish and Percy's inner monologue is mostly missing, doesn't mean that there isn't still room for jokes or running gags. And not only do we get plenty of those here, but a lot of them are original to these scripts, not straight out of the book. I love when Mr. D messes with Percy by telling him he's his dad, and Percy immediately buys it because he doesn't know any better. I love how Percy thinks that his mom fell in love with Jesus. I love that he flosses. If you had told me there's a scene in the PJO show where one of the characters flosses, I'd probably kill myself, but this sequence was so good. I like him and Annabeth not realizing the, what is love song, Percy not knowing how to drive, Grover's getting along song, and Percy bringing it back later. I love them splashing him with water in the fountain, which isn't really a joke, but it must be mentioned because to me it was just an iconic image. Just a lot of good gags, both in dialogue and in the action. It also helps that Walker is such a good, funny actor that even when he isn't joking around, his facial expressions make it clear that he recognizes the ridiculousness of the situations. I do wish that there were more jokes, though. There is absolutely room in later seasons to include more of that. Alright, now that I've brought up Walker's performance as Percy, let's get into what probably mattered most to me and most fans: how they adapted the characters, starting with our main beloved three.
And they come unstuck.
Walker Scobell is without a doubt the best part of this entire series. He is the standout performance, which is pretty important given the fact that he is the main character across all 5 seasons of the show, and it helps that Percy as a character is also honestly pretty great. He's just one of the most book-accurate elements. TV Percy has the sass, he has the fire, he's got bad jokes, he's got at times dumb confidence. He does have a little bit less of all these things than book Percy, but to be fair, it's nearly impossible to separate Percy from his narration, which we get throughout all 5 books. And without most of that narration, we are going to miss out on a lot of his jokes and snark. But even so, I think his personality came through, and that would have been impossible without a young actor as skilled as Walker. He's not just a cute, funny kid either. He also excels when it comes to the more intense moments, like when he's going off on Ares or super subtly expressing his disappointment with Poseidon or clearly developing feelings for Annabeth. This kid is clearly going places in his career, and I, for one, am super excited to see it. This version of Percy, this is probably one of the most important things about him, is also fiercely loyal to his friends, even to a fault. I won't get into why exactly this will be so important plot-wise, but it's just a key aspect of his character, and it's nice to have it set up early. At the very start of the show, Grover gets Percy kicked out of school by lying about him pushing Clarice into the fountain. Percy clearly sees this as a betrayal, something that he would never do to a friend. Another show addition was him taking Annabeth's place on the St. Louis Arch, trying to hold off Echidna and the Chimera while his friends escape. There was another moment with Medusa where Percy could have abandoned his friends, but chose not to. Personally, I don't think Medusa's offer would have been tempting for any kid in that situation, but still. And at the Tunnel of Love, Percy also volunteers to sit in the trap to let Annabeth get Ares' shield and escape. He is self-sacrificial and super loyal. It's very clear that the show was trying to firmly establish this as an element of his character. Despite the absurd situations he finds himself in, Percy's also pretty hard to phase. I like that they kept that Percy has clearly been bullied and is a bit of a social outcast throughout his life. It makes him more emotionally intelligent and also helps explain his willingness to stand up to bullies in all their forms, a super relevant theme in this entire series, especially given its younger audience. On one last, unfortunately down note about Percy's characterization, we have to talk about the exposition problem again. Another aspect of his character that often gets overlooked is that he's genuinely really smart and clever. This is a part of his personality that unfortunately suffers in this version, not because he's dumbed down, but because we don't get to see the actual thought process behind a lot of his realizations or ideas. The most we get to see anyone actually approach an issue strategically in this season is Grover, of all people. We get to see him manipulate Ares into divulging key information about the lightning bolt, from which he then falsely but understandably concludes that Clarice is the lightning thief. But as many viewers have pointed out, a lot of the season is kids arriving on a scene and just immediately figuring out or already know what's going on. This isn't just less exciting than seeing someone figuring it out in real time with critical thinking, it also means we miss out on the character's intelligence. But now that I've brought up Grover, I love Grover in this version, and I like how Aryan plays him. I don't have much to say about him because he's generally just adapted well. It's telling when a fanbase is appreciative of a change to the source material. Grover in the book is kind of just a nervous mess in the first one, but here you get to see multiple sides of him, especially his intelligence. Like his scene with Ares in the diner would absolutely be out of character for book Grover, but TV Grover has this confidence and competence that I actually appreciate. I definitely buy him as the glue holding the trio together, as well as like their put-upon chaperone. The background with Pan and the Cloven Council is also fleshed out a lot more, which is interesting. I definitely appreciate our ability to see scenes through Grover's perspective, as opposed to him just relaying it all to Percy, because we do not need any more exposition dumps. It does frustrate me a bit that we get so much of his backstory, but Annabeth's subplots are kind of shafted, but I'll get into that in a bit. As for Grover in future seasons, I just hope that he's given more opportunities to be funny, like on purpose, like Percy does, as opposed to him just being nervous or awkward and that being the whole joke. Now it is time to talk about my and many people's favorite Percy Jackson character, who sadly also happens to be the most disappointing in this version. She's not handled terribly, but safe to say the Annabeth chase from the books never made it to screen. While Grover was changed significantly and Percy's character was largely maintained both to great success, the changes made to Annabeth's character severely limited her personality, her ability to connect with audiences, and Leah Saba Jeffrey's acting range. Let's start off with a review of book Annabeth. Rick Riordan has been kind of hit or miss when it comes to his writing of female characters. I tend to think that he does a better job than most people do, but it is true that his female characters often start off somewhat trope-ish before eventually growing into their own. The thing is, Annabeth never felt this way. She's a great character from the get-go. She has a clear personality, chemistry with Percy and other members of their gang, true personality flaws, plenty of room to grow, and she follows a solid arc throughout the series. She also maintains several important relationships with various characters outside of Percy, like Luke, Thalia, Grover, Chiron, and her father. She's easily the second most fleshed out and important character in the entire series, which is why she's the only one other than Percy who becomes a main character in the sequel books. Annabeth is consistently wise beyond her years, a brilliant leader and thinker, knowledgeable of a wide range of topics, and very passionate about a few things, especially architecture, which she wants to do in the future. She's also pretty skilled with her dagger, but in general prefers to use her brain to get out of conflicts. She's the kind of person everyone wants to have on their team and nobody wants for an enemy, because she's capable, smart, and usually a few steps ahead of everyone else. But Annabeth also has a personality beyond her intelligence. She's definitely got a soft side, which comes out when she's around animals or when she helps Percy during his early days at camp. She's not afraid of expressing her emotions, whether they be anger, sadness, or joy. She has serious anxieties rooted in her past traumas. Like Percy, she also has major character flaws. While Percy is self-sacrificing and loyal to his friends to a detrimental degree, Annabeth's self-confidence often veers into pride. Whenever she fails, it's usually a result of her own hubris. I don't just mean she's arrogant. The real problem is she consistently overestimates her own capabilities and struggles with recognizing when she needs help. She's incredibly brave in general, but there are a select few things that absolutely paralyze her with fear. For example, in the first book, when they fight Medusa, Annabeth just pops on her invisibility cap and GTFOs because Medusa is one of Athena's arch-enemies and she knows Medusa has it out for her. In situations like this, she's more likely to freeze with fear or try to avoid facing what scares her. But at the end of the day, she cares deeply for her friends above all else and isn't above apologizing when she goes too far or makes a mistake. So what about Annabeth in the show? Let's take a look at the list of her qualities and see what made the cut. Annabeth in the show is like a super serious, no-nonsense mini-adult who seems annoyed with Percy most of the time. Most of her lines are about plot-relevant plans or exposition. She's uncompromising and doesn't seem to have much of a soft side to her. Annabeth's most clearly established quality is her intelligence. Characters like Luke explain how capable and smart she is. She's much quieter in the show, which I think is meant to demonstrate her critical thinking and deep consideration, like when she first runs into Percy after he blows up the bathroom. I get what they were going for with that choice, but it just makes her a bit less compelling. We definitely get to see her as a capable and courageous leader, especially in the first few episodes. She's very knowledgeable about Greek mythology, which allows her to recognize most of the monsters they run into, which, again, less interesting than them figuring it out in real time, but at least it makes sense for her character. She fights sometimes. You get the sense that she would rather be using her brain than her brawn, but it's unfortunate that she doesn't get a real chance to shine in battle because that would make her more of a self-sufficient character who can take care of herself. And because her dagger is actually an important aspect of her character, since it was gifted to her by Luke when she first met him and Thalia as a little kid. Her love of architecture... Okay, this one is actually a little weird because it's the rare instance where it would actually be better to tell and not just show. You hear Annabeth exposit about the St. Louis Arch and the importance of architecture to honor the gods, but unfortunately in the Percy Jackson show, everyone exposits random things at all times, so there's no reason to assume that she's this knowledgeable because she's just passionate about architecture. It could just be because this is important information to know and thus someone needs to state it out loud. This is due to a change from the original text. In the book, the trio has a layover in St. Louis, and Annabeth decides to get out and go visit the Arch because she loves architecture, and it's a modern marvel she's probably never going to get to see again. In the show, their trip to the Arch is entirely motivated by the need to escape Echidna, and most of Annabeth's info dumping about the Arch serves a plot purpose, since now it's like a temple of Athena where they need to go to get her help, and monsters aren't supposed to be able to attack them there. Correct me if I remember incorrectly, but none of this was in the book's lore. I'm guessing this change was made for pacing reasons, like to establish Echidna as a threat earlier and then draw out the conflict with her to fill an entire episode, but it does reinforce the trend of the show prioritizing action over slower dialogue scenes or just funny things like them going sightseeing in St. Louis. We do get a scene at the start of this episode of them talking while trying to fall asleep, very similar to the book, but this scene is mostly used for more plot exposition than character work. We needed Annabeth to tell Percy that she wants to be an architect. We needed to learn that to her, architecture is about building something that will last lifetimes, that being a child of Athena is about creation compared to Poseidon, whom she sees as being about destruction. Her hubris, there's not a lot of evidence of that in this show, especially not as a flaw, as opposed to just a normal amount of confidence. But I'll let this show off the hook because the groundwork is there. It can easily be further developed in later seasons, which is also true to the books. Her hubris isn't explicitly mentioned as her main flaw until the second one. Now, Annabeth's anxieties and fears are not really explored, but they do make some other interesting choices with regards to Annabeth's emotional weaknesses here. In the field of asphodel in the underworld, which looks great by the way, Annabeth becomes rooted to the ground by her past regrets. I don't like that this scene ends with her being separated from Grover and Percy. It felt weird and unnecessarily convoluted, but I am eager to see where they are going with Annabeth's regret here. It's sad that most of Annabeth's softer or funnier side fails to make it into the show. For example, her moment of stopping Cerberus and training him with the ball gets cut. It's another case of the characters fighting their way out of a jam instead of relying on their brains or special skills. But most importantly, in the book, Annabeth, talks about her family's old Doberman and then, starts to cry. It's a crucial reminder that she's not some hardened badass. She's a 12-year-old girl who just happens to be super smart and tough. She also doesn't really get to make jokes or even laugh at Percy's jokes or Grover being silly aside from this one really small moment in the St. Louis Arch episode. There is one moment added where she's in a convenience store and grabs a bunch of random snacks and candy for them all. Some fans pointed out that it could be because she was eager to please them in her own way, or that it could be because she hasn't been outside of camp in a while, and all of these snacks are new and exciting for her 12-year-old brain. So that was cute. About her relationships with characters besides Percy, and screw it, even with Percy, those suffer too, ranging from being underdeveloped to completely unmentioned. There is a reason Annabeth starts off a little bristly around Percy. Poseidon and Athena were always rivals in Greek myth, and in the world of PJO, this adversarial relationship continued to the present day. Annabeth believes the conflict between Athena and Poseidon dooms any chance of a friendship between her and Percy. I really thought they were going to bring this up when Athena gets pissed at the two of them for sending Medusa's head to Olympus. She could have been angry at Annabeth for getting involved with the insolent schemes of the son of Poseidon, but nope. Without this background, Annabeth just seems to be mean to Percy for no real reason at the beginning. Their relationship does develop over the course of the show. You see Annabeth come to genuinely care for Percy, like when he survived the Arch or sacrifices himself on Hephaestus' trap. You see them stick by each other's side in the Lotus Casino and reunite at the end in Camp Half-Blood. But honestly, it may have actually been a tiny bit too much too early. Annabeth's arc in the first season should be about her coming to realize that she and Percy can in fact be friends while Percy comes to care about her a great deal. This first season almost felt like they were falling in love with each other, or at least developing serious crushes, which if you've read the books you know takes a lot longer. Which makes sense, considering they're only 12 in book/season 1, their relationship is supposed to grow and mature as they do. Yes, Annabeth does mention later on that she had a crush on Percy from the beginning, but when it comes to their actual exchanges and actions, they need to develop a real friendship first. To be fair, I am nitpicking a little bit. Her relationship with Percy isn't done terribly. Even elements that go unmentioned, like the Poseidon-Athena rivalry, could be brought up later on. The biggest issues are her relationships with characters from her backstory. She doesn't seem to have a crush on Luke in this version, which would be a totally fine change given that she already has this found family sibling-like relationship with Luke and Thalia, and her relationship with Thalia was touched on and surely going to be developed more in future seasons, so that was fine. But her little sister relationship with Luke was more tell than show, specifically Luke telling Percy their backstory and telling him that they're like family to each other. It was just a weird choice to have more scenes with the two of them than with Annabeth and Luke, especially considering that we're no longer limited to Percy's perspective. The ending scene with Luke's betrayal is the ultimate consequence of this. Percy seems to react with more shock and horror at Luke actually being evil than Annabeth does, despite the fact that she's known him almost her entire life. This actually got some mockery on Twitter because it's just weird to make this some kind of emotional twist when Luke isn't necessarily like a great friend of Percy. It's supposed to be a twist for the audience because Annabeth trusts him. Having Annabeth there to react was actually a good choice, but instead she basically only served to save Percy. All in all, I feel like they reduced a lot of Annabeth's character to her relationship with Percy, and a lot of their relationship to the romantic element alone. I just really hope that in later seasons, they understand how important Annabeth is to the actual heart of the story, not just Percy's character. So how did all of this happen? How did Annabeth's character get so shafted in comparison to Percy, who felt just as multifaceted and compelling as he was in the books? So, like a lot of book authors, Hollywood has an issue with writing women and, by extension, girls. This is very sad and a little disturbing, but it's also very deeply ingrained in writing and character tropes at this point. TV Annabeth falls into several tropes that book Annabeth just doesn't. You might have heard smarter people than me say this, but it's very common for writers to confuse a lack of emotions with badassery or independence when it comes to female characters. On the other hand, any display of emotions outside of rage are seen as undercutting the strength of the character. The end result is a female character who, instead of being well-rounded with a full inner life and flaws that could lead to satisfying character development, is entirely one note. Worse than that, such stories imply that women cannot be feminine or emotional while also being trusted leaders or skilled fighters or intelligent thinkers. Annabeth's characterization in the TV show immediately gave me this vibe. To be clear, she's not as bad as some other examples. She is allowed to show some emotions, and in the scene in the underworld, that suggests that she has some weaknesses and insecurities even if they are buried very deep within her. But she is so overly serious, almost like they were nervous to show her having fun or being happy. She barely gets any moments to be something either than the smart one or the leader. I don't know if these changes were a deliberate choice, a consequence of some of the new writers misinterpreting her character, or Rick and the others just forgetting the point of her character, but I kind of think it was a combination of all of those things. Given that the pairing of the no-nonsense smart girl with the funny, goofy hero is just another tired trope in sci-fi fantasy and especially action, I would believe all the writers just fell into this trap without realizing that that was even what they were doing. Now, having explained all of the flaws with Annabeth's character, I must also stress that I do not mind Leah's performance. Yes, it's more serious than it should have been, but I am sure that she was instructed to act it that way, and also she is very clearly a talented young actress who grabs your attention when given the chance. Even if you don't like this version of Annabeth as much as the books, she really sells her, and those emotional moments, she really shines. When you see clips of Leah, Aryan, and Walker together, they're all clearly such good friends with such good vibes as a group. In fact, I would argue that of the three, Leah is the closest to her book counterpart. She's fierce and clearly respected by her friends, but they also aren't afraid to clown on her. And in return, she's got a good head on her shoulders like Annabeth, but also has wit and humor.
I heard we're here for the watch party.
You heard that we're here for the watch party? Sassy's most accurate. Let's be honest.
Are they saying sassy because he's sassy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Leah. Yes, Leah.
I hope that in the future, as Annabeth's walls start to break down around Percy, Leah will get to bring more of her own personality to the role. Pretty much all of the supporting cast is done well. Luke is charming, and although I think he should have gotten more scenes with Annabeth instead of just talking about her, I can buy him as a big brother figure. Clarice is a good bully, Chiron is a wise and reserved mentor, Percy's mom is definitely characterized differently than in the books, being less innocently sweet and a little harder on Percy, obviously because of all the stress she is under, but I think the choice to make her a more well-rounded character works very well. You can see where Percy gets his hard-headed toughness from. When she was first cast, I was a little surprised because I had always seen her as an older mom, just given how mature and level-headed she is throughout the books, but I came to love this casting choice. Her being so young actually emphasizes how out of her depth she is as a single mom, and makes Poseidon look even worse for leaving her and Percy to fend for themselves, even though he also gets fleshed out more in this version to great effect. Still, the streak continues of no adaptation being brave enough to include her first-degree murdering her abusive husband. As for the gods, as I mentioned before, they all play a much bigger on-screen role here than in the first book. I don't know how popular this opinion is, but I actually liked almost all of them. Lance Reddick as Zeus is incredible in all the ways you'd expect the king of Olympus to be. It's going to be very hard to fill those shoes. I actually didn't mind him suspecting that Kronos was back before Percy told him. I think it serves as a reminder of how big and ancient this world is, plus his scene discussing it with Poseidon was actually really good. Hermes was a valuable inclusion when it comes to setting up what makes Luke turn to Kronos. Not crucial for this season, but interesting nonetheless. And the scene with him in the casino establishes this theme of parenting that gets followed through on later. Poseidon is warm but worn down, a deadbeat dad who still cares for his son, but doesn't really think that pursuing a real relationship built on love and honesty is worth the pain. Hephaestus is also sweet. It makes sense for a god like him, kind of an outsider to the Olympians, to be the one most receptive to what Annabeth has to say about glory and the expectations of being a demigod. Ares is very funny, more so than in the books in fact, and he provides an inside look into how the gods are besieged by politics and family drama, which can be easily exploited by any hero or villain savvy enough. Mr. D is also funny, but clearly uninterested in dealing with all of these kids as he should be. There's really only one god that I think was done dirty, one where I think the casting and writing both failed. That's obviously Hades. Hades is actually one of my favorite god characters from the books. It takes a really long time to see him grow into a character you can actually like, but it's worth it. If you don't know, Hades in Greek mythology is actually one of the better gods when it comes to his actions. He kidnaps Persephone, but other than that, he really doesn't do anything awful, unlike his two brothers who are both flat-out monstrous at times, especially in how they treat mortal women. Hades mostly just keeps to himself in the underworld. He didn't really bother anybody, and even though he was the god of the land of the dead, he wasn't responsible for death itself or any of the other plagues upon humanity. In the Percy Jackson books, Hades starts out ambiguously evil. Like, he's not malevolent, but he will do anything to further his own interests, even if it means stepping on some demigods or mortals in the process. But later on, spoilers, after Hades' two children emerge, we find out that he has a soft side and genuinely cares for his family. He's very hard on Nico, even abusive, but after the war ends, the two of them repair their relationship and end up with one of the healthiest godly parents-demigod-child relationships in all of the books. Hades is like true neutral. He's scary and powerful, but would only use that power if forced to, and he will not feel forced to unless something threatens his quiet life in the underworld. In the show, Hades is like a fast-talking hipster guy. I don't even know how to describe him, but they were clearly going for someone significantly more personable and not at all intimidating. If I had to hazard a guess, I think they just wanted all of the gods to have really distinct personalities, and that's why he's like this, as opposed to being more serious and epic like Poseidon and Zeus. But in my opinion, it was not worth the change. It's not like they forgot Hades is supposed to be one of the better gods. They include him telling Percy and Grover that they can ask for refuge in his palace and thus be safe while the war with Kronos goes on. But this almost feels like too much too soon. These moments of mercy and even sympathy for mortals are more effective when juxtaposed with a god's raw power. And this guy just seems like a guy. I'm not sure what the writers have planned here. We'll just have to see how this plays out in future seasons. Just to wrap up, I want to touch on the look of this show. I am far from an expert on either cinematography or visual effects, so take what I'm going to say with a grain of salt, but in general, I'm of two minds. I think pretty much all the visual effects look really good, even great. But on the other hand, the overall look of the show does suffer from the current rash of TV being poorly lit or just underlit for some reason. It's far from the worst offender, but there are a few episodes, especially the one at Hephaestus' theme park at night, where you genuinely need to adjust your brightness to make anything out. Beyond this, the color scheme of the show is also strangely understated. I think this actually affects the mood and tone, making it feel less outlandish and comedic because it feels so much more down-to-earth and pseudo-realistic. There are a lot of cool colors, lots of grays and dark blues, like the ocean during a storm, which makes a visual sense, but it's also just more boring to look at. Still, the set pieces all look amazing, and the cinematography is genuinely great. The way that Percy's showdown with the Minotaur, for example, is shot, edited, and scored together creates an image straight out of the books and just an overall epic vibe. It's also one of the only times that a fade to black in the show makes sense because Percy would actually pass out there.
Taken away to the dark side.
So having said everything that I did in this video, it's impossible to ignore that I said more negative things than positive. All the criticisms that I came up with, the areas that it fell short of its source material, the weaknesses I identified on my second, third, fourth viewings, it just seems obvious that this show would be an overall disappointment to me. Like, I must bow down to the objectivity of art criticism and acknowledge that this show is technically not good, despite my fangirling and excitement to see my favorite characters come to life on screen. Well, here's the thing. No, I like this show. A lot. I'd even say that I loved watching it. I watched almost the whole season with a smile on my face the first time. Do you know how rare that is? Despite being hyper aware of every change made from the source material, I still felt like I was watching the books come to life. I still loved every interaction and got excited for each new character introduction and location and set piece. And unlike most horrible adaptations of things that I love, which I mostly just try to banish from my mind and altogether ignore the existence of, I found myself wanting to discuss every element of this show, engage in fan theories, share GIFs and clips, look at fan art of the characters' show versions, and just generally be an active fan again. Yes, there are a lot of spaces in the fandom that are toxic or overly negative or just include a lot of infighting, but I've been able to find spaces on Twitter and Instagram where the fans are open to criticisms of the show but also generally like and appreciate this adaptation. Side note, I'm also following a bunch of people who are now reading the books or reading Heroes of Olympus for the very first time, spoiler-free. Side note, I'm also following a bunch of people who are now reading the books and spin-offs for the very first time, spoiler-free, and it is like looking through a time machine / portal to an alternate dimension in which these books all came out today. Yeah, highly recommend that experience. I think a lot of the variation in terms of fan reactions boils down to expectations and standards. In terms of expectations, those who were expecting the most from this show, just an absolute masterpiece that follows the books to a T while also being one of the greatest TV series of all time, were surely setting themselves up for disappointment. Meanwhile, if your only touchstone for the PJO adaptations was the 2010 movie and you were not following the news of the production of the show, you were probably overjoyed with the end result. I fell into neither camp. I knew early on that this show was going to be better than the movie. I even hoped that it was going to be great, but I didn't have very specific expectations. I wasn't hinging my reaction on the inclusion of specific elements from the book, so every time we got to a scene or character from the books, I was practically surprised and newly delighted. Whenever there was an element changed or missing, I didn't really notice it until reflection. This is a great sign that the series can suck you in and stand alone from the books, which I would imagine is only stronger for people who didn't even read them. I did not think this show was going to feel as epic and dramatic as it felt, or that it would evoke such strong emotions, especially when it came to the theme of parenting. I was just pleasantly surprised at all the original elements that succeeded, along with the elements adapted well. I also think fans have different standards when it comes to what they'll approve of. To super generalize into two different camps, some fans will be automatically biased in favor of any official canon work in a fandom, especially when made or endorsed by the original creator. They'll love and passionately defend any such work, whether it be a new sequel, spin-off, or an adaptation like this. They'll always look on the bright side to the point of being blind to legitimate criticisms. Then, some fans will automatically be biased against any new piece of work in their original property. Nothing outside of the originals, which they probably grew up with, will ever be good enough, even if it was made or endorsed by the original creator. They will look for any little flaw and use it to tear down the entire work and call fans dumb or uncritical for liking it. As exaggerated and unfair as these descriptions sound, I'm not gonna lie, I'm pretty clearly the first type of fan. I wouldn't say that I'm incapable of accepting criticisms of Percy Jackson, whether they be the books or the show. I mean, given this video, I would hope not. But I'm also certainly an optimist. Also, being negative about things that I like kind of bums me out. I'm in fandom to enjoy these stories and characters, not to pick them apart like we're grading someone's creative writing project. I like when people like things. So while it's kind of embarrassing to admit I have low standards, I kind of do. In 90% of timelines, I really enjoyed the PJO show. That being said, after analyzing it, I do feel like my gut instincts are correct. I think the main way that this show succeeds is very closely tied to the ways that it falls short. By making this show feel more like an action-adventure than the unique and slightly odd mix of comedy and fantasy that worked so well in book form, it actually falls into a completely different genre of TV. I think it does let the show appeal to a wider audience, even if it connects less strongly with any particular subset. There are definitely downsides to this approach, as I mentioned before, but the upside is that for a serialized action kids show, this is kind of unparalleled outside of animation. It's taking its source material more seriously than the book, but not too seriously to still be fun and comical. Beyond that, the showrunners and Disney clearly took the series seriously. They gave it a real budget, one similar to the first season of The Mandalorian. The episodes are directed with artistry, the special effects look great. The show was made with dedication and care, which just matters so much and is such a sharp departure from the cynical cash grab that was the 2010 movie. The changes to the characters all worked in context of the rest of the show. Even Annabeth fared all right as the show went on, although I would still like her to open up more and be more personable in the future. And of course, I can't pretend that Walker as Percy isn't like a top 3 reason why this adaptation is still an overall success in my mind. He's genuinely that good, and his chemistry with basically every other actor lifts them up in turn. There are a few ways this show knocks it out of the park, a few ways that it fails, particularly in pacing and writing exposition, and most commonly, ways in which the show deviates from the source material to a mixed degree of success. In the end, though, the show ended up being worth more than the sum of its parts, I think especially for book fans. Of course, there is still room for this show to improve. I gestured at those ways throughout the rest of the video, but just to summarize briefly, they need to integrate the exposition more organically into the dialogue and action, incorporate more reflective and quiet scenes as opposed to just action, even if it means lengthening the episodes. This will fix both the pacing and develop character relationships better. Let Annabeth be Annabeth. Let my girl Leah cook, please. It is okay for girls to like puppies and be scared of spiders and cry sometimes. Make the show look more colorful. Why does it look so dark? Honestly, every new location should have a completely unique look, which will be especially important in season/book 2, where most of the locations are fantastical as opposed to being in the real world. And lastly, I think if Disney wants to pull in a bigger audience of people who didn't read the books, they need to put more personality into it. This is totally achievable without changing the new, more down-to-earth tone of this adaptation. Just increase the frequency of jokes, especially from Percy, and let the main characters joke around and show off their chemistry more. Viewers will understand that that is what makes this property unique beyond just the mythology and action elements. My biggest takeaway is I can't wait for season 2. There is so much room for the world of this show to grow and the characters to really come into their own. And honestly, almost every criticism I have of the show could be easily changed between seasons by just making different writing decisions, without any need for a budget increase or casting changes or drastically different direction choices. As of now, the second season is officially greenlit and in pre-production. Disney, I swear to God, you've committed now. You need to give us 5 seasons of this show. And then 5 seasons of Heroes of Olympus, and then 5 seasons of The Trial of Apollo, and then 3 seasons of Magnus Chase, and then pick up the rights to the Kane Chronicles and adapt those, and then make a standalone film based on The Son of the Stars, and then...
Fantastic gang, well, I don't want to die in the Garden State. We're lost in the woods, somewhere in New Jersey, and we're never gonna make it to LA. We're lost and it's dark, and I think that something's moving, and I think it's coming this way.
Is it a monster?
Was anybody gonna tell me that Leah Sava Jeffries is my mother's cousin's step-granddaughter, or was I supposed to find that out from a random Facebook post myself?